Hello, welcome to the Politics Chicks podcast. I'm Monica Healy.
And I'm Christy Branham.
Today we're talking about something that affects every American, regardless of political affiliation: trust in government. Across the political spectrum, people feel disconnected from the decisions being made on their behalf.
Whether you're a conservative, liberal, independent, or somewhere in between, many Americans feel like lobbyists, special interests, and party insiders have more influence than ordinary citizens.
Our guest today believes technology can change that.
Ramon Perez is the founder of the Digital Democracy Project, a nonpartisan effort that allows voters to weigh in on pending legislation directly from their phones while holding elected officials accountable in real time.
His TED Talk explores the history of democratic participation, why voters are disengaging from the process, and how technology might help bridge the gap between citizens and government.
Ramon, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you.
I really appreciate being on. Thank you for having the opportunity.
Great to have you. So Christy and I were saying that we looked at your TED Talk and we were both all in. You know, sometimes you start watching a TED Talk and you kind of tune out after 5 minutes, but I was hooked and watched the entire way through. And your talk begins with the story of Lieutenant Tyler Brown, your friend and fellow veteran. Tell us about Tyler and why his story is so central to your mission.
Yeah, Tyler was head of me at Georgia Tech. We were both students together. He became a lieutenant in the Army shortly after 9/11. I became a lieutenant in the Air Force shortly after him. And he was killed by a sniper in Ramadi, Iraq in 2004. And he was also our student body president. He was kind of the big man on campus. I think a lot of us saw, great potential in him. And I wanted to dedicate that TED Talk to him because I think his memory, it means a lot to me. It also drives my focus and my commitment to doing this work many years after his passing, because it just, where I am here in DC, I actually goes by his cemetery at Arlington pretty regularly. So, and it still moves me that he was willing, to give the last full measure of devotion. And I hope that we can do the same.
Wow. And you also tell the story of an Iraqi grandmother who risked her life simply to cast a ballot. And that had me riveted. It really did, because, we're facing so many issues in our country right now about being able to vote and people being denied the ability to vote. So can you tell us a little bit about that story and why do those stories matter today?
Right, because these were folks who were engaging in the first elections after Saddam Hussein was toppled from power. And one of the ways that they would make sure that a person didn't vote twice was they would have them dip their finger in purple ink, so that when you would go in and cast your ballot, you would dip your finger in ink, and ink was hard to remove. So it was just a voter security measure. But what happened was a variety of insurgency groups would then attack and mutilate and murder people who they saw with purple ink on their fingers. And people, they were blowing up some of the polling locations. I mean, it was a serious risk. They were attempting to suppress the vote with violence. And the fact that woman and so many others, just normal citizens, but they saw the power in what they were doing, and they were willing to risk their lives to do it. And it meant a lot to me, the image of her holding up that purple finger in defiance of the violence that was allayed against her. It meant a lot.
I think people in our country just don't really understand the lengths that people will go to have that democratic voice. And I think sometimes we take that for granted. So that's a powerful story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I recorded that TED Talk alongside Desmond Meade. He and I were in the studio at the same time that day. And he has a tremendous story because he has spent his lifetime fighting for the right of basically convicted felons to get back their right to vote. And he talks about the power of what voting means to him. And it was, his message was in my heart, I think, when I recorded that TED Talk, because it's hard not to feel disengaged a lot of times. It's hard not to feel like our vote, what's the point? Nothing ever changes and people get checked out and there's so much anxiety and there's this information overload in the media that a lot of people are just tuning out of the process, either tuning out, being unwilling to listen to what's happening in the news, or in some cases just completely disengaging from the voting process. And I think it's really important for us to give people some sense of inspiration that this democracy is still worth maintaining. It is still worth fighting for. And it only takes these individual acts of bravery to make it work. And that's what I'm hoping for, not just in our project, but in the message that we hope to deliver.
Cool. And just so you know, Monica and I have pets, obviously. So I can duck down. If the dog starts barking and you're talking, just keep talking because I'll just duck myself down.
I'd like to
when I'm
think
doing
he
the
was maybe
editing.
clapping, he was
He
approving the message.
He was applauding. He went to No Kings with me.
He did,
And
yeah.
yeah, he was dressed up in his little frog outfit with his brother. So he's a very democratic dog.
So he was like, here.
Here.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I think it's you, Monica.
Oh, he
Or is it
already
me?
answered that one.
Okay. All right, I'll go next. And I'll take out all this commentary so it actually looks
So,
professional.
hey, I like the dog commentary. You got to leave that in.
I think we should
Okay,
leave
I'll
the dog commentary in, yeah.
It's pretty funny. Okay. What was the moment when you realized our political system wasn't just frustrating people, it was actively disengaging them?
Yeah, you see it a lot of times in little moments when you're interacting with your family at Thanksgiving, or when you're interacting with people who are just telling you, you know what, I can't deal with it anymore, and they just sort of tuned it out. I think that the moment for me for wanting to do something intentional was probably January 6th. I mean, I talk about it in the TED Talk, the feeling that people are so convinced that the system no longer listens to them that they are willing to engage in violence, essentially, to get back their sense of agency and power in a system that they feel detached from. I also talk about in the TED Talk, but the similar feeling I got from in Portland was the kind of the exact opposite. But people felt like the city was no longer. This was during the Black Lives Matter protests. Basically, a series of anarchist groups took over the city. And kicked out the city government, the police force for several months, sort of ran the city. And I felt like when people believe that democracy does not deliver, they will look for alternatives. And that alternative may be in the form of dictatorship or anarchy. It's not going to be pleasant, but people are going to look for something that gives them a sense of agency and control when they feel like that agency and control is lost. And so I wanted to spend some time and energy evaluating why do we feel this sense of disconnection. And the more I dug into it, I think there's a really good book your audience should take a look at called The Politics Industry, which is an excellent book, but it describes a lot of the system of incentives that have been broken over the course of decades that have led us to where we are. And if you look at the fact that 94% of Americans now live in a congressional district, a U.S. House district that is no longer competitive, meaning it's not within a 5 percentage point margin of victory in a November election. That means only 6% of Americans actually have a real choice on their ballot in November for their U.S. House. If you look at, like in my home state in Florida, something like 70% of the seats in the state legislature, state House and Senate went uncontested because there's an incumbent Democrat or an incumbent Republican, nobody bothers to run against them because there's just the districts are so heavily gerrymandered that there's no point in wasting time and money competing in the marketplace of ideas. So if we're basically giving people no real choice based on where you live, 80% of Americans live in a state that is a one-party state, meaning one party controls the legislature, both chambers, the governor's mansion, as well as usually the Supreme Court of that state. So we talk about a two-party system as if that is still the case, but the practical reality is that most Americans live in a one-party system. And in that one-party system, they have been carved out of the process through a series of gerrymandering and closed primaries and voter suppression techniques and making it hard to get access to the ballot and the immense amount of money you have to raise in order to run for office so that most people don't. If you look at all that system that stands between us and our elected officials, it's no surprise that people start to feel disengaged or feel like their vote doesn't matter, because in a lot of ways, depending on where you live, your vote is intentionally removed so that it doesn't matter. And I think that's where our project is meant to give sort of an end around using technology to say, well, what if we go back to the very basics, Washington's concept of the modern day Cincinnatus, A legislator is meant to be a normal person from the community who goes and represents that district. What if we give them the tools to do exactly that? And so we put together a project in partnership with Votes, and that's spelled VOATZ. They build this mobile voting software for military voters overseas to cast a ballot on their phones. They vote from their phones. And so they've had to do all this tremendous security protocol to make that work effectively. And we said, well, if you can verify that somebody is a U.S. citizen, is a resident of the state, is on the voter file, has a photo ID that matches their face, how they take a selfie scan, and then you put a ballot onto a blockchain and you guarantee there's no manipulation in that process so that the vote that's cast is the vote that's counted. If you can do all of those things, then why do we have to wait every couple of years for people to have a say in their government? Why can't we create the Netflix of government? Let's build government on demand so that people can engage as much or as little as they want on whichever policy they want. And we can use this technology to load legislation that's being debated in their capital, whether it's in Washington or in Tallahassee or their state capital, and they can engage on the bills directly. They can say, here's the plain language text of this legislation. We actually give them some really cool AI tools to better understand the legislation, translate it into regular English from legalese. We provide them the best opportunity to educate themselves on what the policies are, and then cast a vote in the app, let their legislators know how they want them to vote on that bill, and then hold them accountable in an apples to apples comparison, saying, this is what the people in your district wanted. This is how you actually voted on the exact same bill on the floor in the legislature, and how often did that match? That's the basic premise of what we're trying to do with technology, is we're just trying to give people a say in the process and some accountability over the results.
Well, you're really digging into some of the nitty gritty. So let's back up a little bit, because I think some of our listeners probably don't know what the Digital Democracy Project is. So can you take us from, basics and then build us through, like, what does it do? What does it look like?
Okay, so Digital Democracy Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization where we are using mobile voting software and AI to let people learn about legislation that's being debated in Congress, as well as weigh in and tell their legislators how they want them to vote on that bill. So let's say the Iran War Powers Resolution was one of them recently that's actively in debate. We see what's coming up for debate. We see what's getting a committee assignment, what's likely to make it to the floor of the U.S. House or the Senate or the State House or State Senate. And we load that into the website and into the app so people can actually read the full text of the bill if they want. They can also chat with a chat bot where we load all the legislation, hundreds of thousands of pages of legislative documents. The chatbot can summarize that in plain language for us, tell us pros and cons, tell us which organizations support or oppose, tell us what are the consequences of passing a piece of legislation. So they can educate themselves on the bill, and then they can vote. As long as they're verified as a U.S. citizen, a resident of the state, they vote in the app, and their vote gets put onto real-time maps that get updated as people around the country are voting on a bill, so that legislators can see what their district wants on that same bill. So the idea would be, there's an active debate on War Powers Resolution. The legislator looks at the map and they say, well, what does my district think about this particular bill? And it's real-time public polling effectively, except that they know that these are people in their district because we've verified them against the voter file for that particular state. And we've verified them with a photo ID that matches a selfie scan. So they know that it's a real human being, and it's using all the device level encryption that you would expect from a system that has been verified for real elections. So the Votes app is actually active in several states already for real elections, but mainly for military voters overseas, as well as for people with disabilities who either have trouble getting to the polls or are visually impaired so they can't read the touchscreens in a polling booth. So those are the states that have been using the Votes app for that purpose. We're just using it as a nonprofit for the purpose of letting people weigh in on legislation.
This is like the ultimate in civic engagement.
That's the
and
hope.
accountability.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
exactly
and
right.
accountability.
Because, so for instance, in our state, we have Pete Stauber, who is northern Minnesota. He is the person who actually introduced the legislation to allow mining in the Boundary Waters. And if you ever come to Minnesota, you need to go to the Boundary Waters. It is one of the most beautiful, pristine places on earth. But he repeatedly will come back and tout all of the infrastructure money that he has brought to the state of Minnesota,
Hmm.
yet he has voted no on every single bill. And that is not uncommon. A lot of Republicans, even, and I'm going to just say a lot of politicians and representatives, because
Yeah.
I'm sure that it's happening on the Democrat side as well,
Yeah. Yeah.
will take credit for legislation and for funding that they voted against. And
Right.
this kind of holds their feet to the fire, and we can look at it and say, but you voted no for that, so don't try to take credit for that.
That's exactly
So,
right. Yeah, it's oftentimes difficult to actually find how a particular legislator voted because you have to dig through layers of procedural votes and figure out which bill was actually voted on, and was one of them to advance it out of committee, was another one to actually cloture vote. I mean, there's these voice votes, there's these unanimous consent votes. I mean, it's a lot to dig through, and we try to curate that, and we have legislative analysts who work for us whose job is basically figure out what's coming out of committee, what's going to make it to the floor, and let's load it into the app before the entire Senate or the entire House votes on it. So that, one, they have a real input from their voters beforehand, and two, we can say, okay, well, we provided you our input. Now, what did you do as a result of that? And trace it back so that we have an apples to apples comparison. If everybody in a district wants them to vote yes for this Iran war powers resolution because it constrains the power of the president, and that congressman votes no, then it becomes very obvious this is what the district wanted and this is what the congressman did. And over the course of the hundreds of bills that we've tracked, you get a real trend line to see who is accountable to their district and who is not. And that's what we're trying to grade people on. There are a lot of organizations, the Sierra Club will provide a scorecard on environmental policy, or Moms Demand Action will provide a scorecard on gun policy. We're the only ones providing a scorecard on democracy. We're saying your job is to represent your district, and are you doing that basic job?
What kind of
love it.
feedback are you hearing from both voters and from lawmakers in the places where you've implemented this?
I think voters, we get overwhelmingly positive feedback from voters who feel like they don't have a sense of agency in this process. They don't have this feeling of transparency. As you pointed out, it's tough to even hold your legislators accountable. And because of the election process, 91% of them get reelected no matter what they do. And they can stay in office until they retire or die for the most part. So there isn't any feeling like anybody gets held accountable for some of these bad votes, right? So I think voters overwhelmingly like the idea. It's the legislators. This is interesting. We've had Republicans and Democrats support us. We had a bipartisan appropriation bill that I talk about in the TED Talk, but we had a senior Republican out of Ocala and a junior Democrat out of Orlando worked together to draft that bill, pushed it all the way through the process, and Ron DeSantis vetoed it. So it's not necessarily a party thing. We've had Republicans who say, well, this is great. It's basically free public polling. They would normally spend 40, 50 grand to poll their districts, right? It's a lot of money, and they're not going to do it on every single bill. It's not reasonable given the cost. They would only do it maybe once in an election cycle if they have a competitor, which most of them don't. So they don't really poll their districts all that often. Town halls are their most, and a lot of them don't even do that. So,
Right.
basically, the other issue is if you call your congressman, if we think of this as like a modern adaptation of calling the switchboard or writing an email, the challenge is, I've spent enough time in Tallahassee and in DC to see how these guys do their workflow, where they get so many emails in a given day that a lot of them are literally just using like Gmail filters. The same thing you would use in your inbox, Outlook or Gmail. They just basically filter keywords, put them into folders, and they try to get a sense of how many people, emails came in on that particular topic. But they are so overwhelmed by forms that are filled out on the internet, or now a lot of it is AI generated emails, that they really just don't look at any of this because they can't validate that this is a real human being. And they can't validate that if it is a real human being, that that's a person who's actually in their district. So most of it goes into a spam filter and it's never really tracked. We're trying to do the work on the front end to validate that these are real human beings and they're in their district. So a lot of the legislators saw tremendous value in that, just to hear from the districts. But then we show, the scorecard concept, and a lot of them are like, "Oh, wait." So,
Right?
so we're like, "Whoa." But you got to hold these two stakeholders together, right? You want the legislators to see the benefit of getting real, like high quality input from their districts, but you want to see the voters to see some point in doing this. Otherwise, they're like, "Why am I spending my time reading through legislation and providing my input when nobody listens to me anyway?" That's the most common thing we hear. They're like, "I love this idea, but nobody cares about me anyway. So what's the point?" And so to try to keep people engaged, you have to do both at the same time. And so we've had a couple of dozen legislators who've endorsed the project, and you can see them up on our supporters page, who've said they believe in what Digital Democracy Project's doing. They want to use these tools to hear from voters. Some of them are candidates running against an incumbent. Some of them are sitting legislators. But the point is that we've got to find the kind of people who see themselves as servant leaders and are not threatened by this.
Yeah.
You just mentioned legislators spending much of time reading through legislation, and we've heard some lawmakers talk about, well, I didn't read that part. And you put that
Yes.
in front of citizens, and it's that much more daunting. So how do you make this digestible for the average American?
Yeah, I think the two major technological advantages that have developed that make this project possible. One is mobile voting, and specifically, I think because votes uses blockchain, I would say blockchain-based mobile voting. But the other is AI. I mean, AI is a tremendous technological advancement for lowering the barrier to get access to really good information. In our case, what we're doing is we take the bills directly from Congress or from the state houses where we're working, and we load those directly in, and we just ask you to read this and summarize it in plain language. Don't use legalese, and give us a summary, and as well as a nonpartisan pros and cons. When we first started this project, we did this manually. I had a Republican and a Democrat who were both working together. We started this in just Florida legislation, in just Tallahassee. So they had Tallahassee experience. They were legislative aides. They already knew how to do this, and they would just read the bills and work together on a nonpartisan summary. But that is thousands and thousands of pages. It was hard to even keep up. So once we introduced AI, it drastically increased the number of bills we could carry. So now these guys just review the results, make sure there's no hallucinations, make sure it doesn't say anything crazy, validate it against external sources. So we do a fair bit of checking before it goes out the door. And then once it goes out the door, we feel greater confidence that the voters can trust what it's saying. So that's our internal process. But like I say, we offer a chat bot as well. So if they want more details than just a summary and a list of pros and cons, they can be like, "Well, I heard that the one big beautiful bill is going to affect SNAP payments." Well, is that true? How does it affect SNAP payments? And it can come back and say, "Yeah, Section 231F says that as a result of this bill passing, there's going to be work requirements for food stamps," or whatever it is. So they can get really in the weeds if they choose, and it gives people greater sense of confidence. As well as gives them just a chance to educate themselves. I think we've heard back from a lot of teachers who use our site to teach their students about public policy in ways that are much more easily approachable than in the past. So I'm excited about that. And I think for a lot of voters who just to see the bills that never get any media coverage, because this is another thing that I find fascinating. There just are not a lot of local reporters anymore, especially in the state houses. All of the newsrooms have been gutted. They're relying mostly on the Associated Press and like wire services. So they don't have anybody really covering the detail about these policies. That used to be a lot of our source. And now those sources really aren't there anymore. So for a lot of people, they're hearing about a bill for the first time when we load it into their mobile app to have a look at it. So I think that's been pretty exciting too, to try to help fill some of that gap to a degree.
And you just brought up the media. So Monica and I had a gentleman who was a broadcast attorney reach out to us, and we actually wrote an article based on our interview with him. He is not ready to come on the podcast yet because he is a former government employee and he is just protecting himself. But we did write an article, and he brought up something interesting that aligns with what you said about local newsrooms. When Nexstar merges with Tegna, they are going to be reverting to Newsmax as the local news for all of their affiliates across the country. And that is 80, what did he say, Monica? It was like 80%. It was an enormous
It's a
number
huge
of
proportion
households.
of, yeah.
Yes. which is terrifying.
Wow.
And so, yeah, so it
And
just,
all the more
that
reason
just,
you need to seek out independent journalists.
I think so.
yes.
I mean, I think the role that you guys play with all of this corporate consolidation, the role of independent media is going to be tremendously important.
Mhm.
And also just for, for our project, it's going to be tough to get through the gauntlet of corporate news to get the word out. And I think a lot of the success we've been seeing is through independent media. So that's where new ideas are going to have to go through, because I think a lot of the guardians at the gate in the corporate media world are going to make the kind of things that we're doing to try to innovate our political system. It's going to be tougher, I think, to get through that.
And are you finding people are more engaged and more interested in the policy when it's presented to them in plain language? Because they deliberately write these bills, first of all, to deceptively hide things in them. So you can read it and misinterpret it.
Mm-hmm.
And it could actually be for something completely opposite of what it's presenting itself as. And
Yeah.
like you said, the legalese is overwhelming in it. Your eyes roll back in your head when you read legislation.
Absolutely. It's
So,
written by lawyers for lawyers or for some future judge who has to adjudicate this particular language. It's not written for us. And you bring up an excellent point. The reason we started writing our own summaries was because at the very beginning, we used the abstracts provided by the state of Florida. And then what happened was, if you recall, there was a 6-week abortion ban that was passed. And when we carried the bill, the title of the bill was Parenting and Prenatal Support was the title of the bill. And in the abstract provided by the state, it didn't mention the word abortion or gestation or the fact that it was a 6-week limit or the fact that there would be criminal penalties applied to doctors as well as to mothers for terminating a pregnancy. So we decided we simply could not, in good conscience, put the bill into our system without writing a summary that actually told people what the bill does. And if you just took it from the Florida Senate website, you had no clue that that's what that bill does. And so we started writing our own summaries back then, and we've carried that out consistently because of the concern that oftentimes things get buried in the legislative language, either intentionally or just because it's mystifying to understand what it actually does.
Let's talk about the tally maps, because
Mhm.
that's where things really get interesting.
yeah.
Absolutely. Right. So the idea is because we're recording inside the vote system, votes get recorded onto a blockchain. They get encrypted. So we do protect the secret ballot. So we know that Christy is a registered voter in Minnesota. We know Monica's a registered voter in California, or Ramon's a registered
Minnesota.
voter. Okay. Still in
Yeah.
Minnesota. Okay.
Still Minnesota.
Okay, cool. And Ramon's a registered voter in Florida, and we know, which precinct they're assigned to and all that. We know that these are real human beings and we know they're registered to vote. But then when you go to cast a ballot, your details get encrypted, and there's a process called homomorphic encryption. What it does is it allows you to perform mathematical computations against encrypted information, which means it gets encrypted, it gets put onto the blockchain, but you can still add up. If Christy and Monica agree on a policy and disagree with Ramon, you would have 2 pluses and, 2 yeses and 1 no. We could do that without decrypting the information. And that's a really powerful attribute of what makes mobile voting even possible in the first place. You have to have supreme confidence that these are real people and not some robot. And you have to also protect their right to privacy. That's what makes it a uniquely difficult problem, which I think is exciting about what Votes and others in this space have been building towards. So votes get put onto the blockchain. We take those off the blockchain every couple of hours and put it onto maps on our website, where we show the breakdown based on the data that's on the voter file. So if it's a federal bill, let's say the Iran War Powers Act, you'll see how are people voting by state, because that aligns with the U.S. Senate, as well as how are people voting by House district, so aligning with their congressional district. If it's a state level bill, we will show maps of how are people voting based on their state Senate or their state House district. In some fun states like Washington, the state House and the state Senate is actually the same districts, which is interesting. But some states do that. In other states like Massachusetts, they don't use numbers. They just call things by name, which has made that a fun data challenge. But so that's a lot of the work that we do is that mapping effort, because we want legislators our ultimate goal is influence legislators to do what their districts tell them to do. So our ultimate goal is to provide that continuously updating process so that they can actually use it on a floor vote. But the other thing too is you can imagine a lot of different organizations care about policy too, and they, we've worked with Fair Vote, for example, Fair Representation Act, which is a reform bill that will allow ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, open, like a variety of democracy reforms. And so they draft a bill and want us to carry it so that they can actually get some feedback from voters at large about what do people think about the Fair Representation Act. And then they can take that into the different legislators that they're interacting with and say, hey, this is what your district thinks about this bill. Wouldn't you like to vote with your district on this bill? It becomes part of their advocacy efforts. And I think that's, to me, very exciting is seeing how different organizations are wanting to use this kind of data to promote a bill that they've either written or that they support or that they oppose. And our goal as an organization is that we don't take a position on any bill. We're just providing the tools. And ultimately, it's up to these different organizations who do take a position on the bill to advocate how they want to advocate. The same for legislators. It's not up to us to convince a legislator to do something or take a position on a particular policy. We're just trying to convince legislators to be responsive to their districts. If they happen to be in a really red district, they vote according to their district. Great, they'll get a good score. Same thing for a very blue district, same thing for a purple district. So it's, that's part of the goal here is we don't want to punish people for taking a position that somehow like we don't want. It has nothing to do with us. Or we don't want to punish people if a bill is supremely popular, but in that congressman's district, that bill is unpopular. They should vote according to their district. That's the way we think of it, right? They're meant to represent their particular constituency.
And your platform shows how voters in the individual districts want their representatives to vote. And you touched on this earlier and you were like, their hackles went up when legislators, they found out that there's going to be accountability there. So why don't you just touch on a little bit more about how those legislators kind of had their hackles go up when they figured out that this wasn't just them finding out from their constituents how they would like them to vote, but also that their constituents would see in real time how they're voting.
I I have been thrown out of the offices of both Democrats and Republicans alike. I mean, I had a Democrat once.
That's a bipartisan thing for you?
It's a bipartisan thing. We've got legislators who accountability is not their thing sometimes. But I also, there's this fear that who's really behind this? But like, is it Elon Musk money? Is it George Soros money? Who's pushing me to do one thing or another? Who's behind Digital Democracy Project? There's that too, which, I'm like, hey, I would love to have like billionaire money. We're an all volunteer team. We do this on our nights and weekends. You know what I mean? And
Right.
I've also I had a Democrat once who accused me of being some sort of stalking horse for Ron DeSantis, trying to convince that person to vote the way the governor wants. At the same time, the governor was vetoing our funding. You know what I mean? So it's kind of surreal because there's so much fear and anxiety and the us versus them mentality that it can be difficult to break through that and say, look, we actually are just a collection of concerned citizens who, if you look at our board of directors, represents every kind of political ideology. And our goal is to make democracy work because we believe in democracy more than we believe in our own personal ideas. I'm not here to push Ramon's opinion. I am here because I believe in this 250-year experiment and I want it to last so that my children and grandchildren can actually take
Amen.
advantage of that.
And we
I think-
appreciate that.
Absolutely. And I think you've addressed a lot of concerns that the average voter might have in terms of security and accountability. What we're seeing right now in terms of a push for voter suppression in mail-in ballots touches personally for you. As a veteran, you've shared your frustration with absentee voting while deployed overseas. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's tough because depending on where you are, it can be incredibly difficult to get a piece of mail out and back home. If you're on a submarine under the ocean, you're not getting mail service. It might take 6 months before you're actually going to be in a port and be able to send a letter out. So I was actually, as a lieutenant assigned in Korea, it was my job to make sure that the 450 airmen in our squadron got their absentee ballots filed in time for their respective states. This is the other thing. I had to track like 50 states worth of primary
I was going to
elections.
say, everyone has a different.
Exactly what the requirements are. Like, does your state allow it to be postmarked by a certain date, or does it have to be received by the supervised office? There was a recent court case, I thought it was the Supreme Court, that asked this question about, is it obligatory that they count military ballots if those ballots show up after Election Day? And
It was the Supreme Court.
it was the Supreme Court, right?
It was.
And I believe the ruling was that the Supreme Court was not going to place that requirement onto the states. It was up to the states to determine that they weren't going to like overturn a state's law on whether or not to count a military ballot. It's actually quite common for military ballots to get thrown out. And military voters overseas are often one of the most, I guess you could say, disenfranchised voter groups and have much lower voter turnout because of the challenges in voting. And military, not just military folks, but a lot of American expats who live overseas have this similar type of problem. I lived in London for several years, and I had to spend like $50, $60 to FedEx my ballot back, and because I wanted to make sure it actually arrived on time and got counted. Not everybody's going to do that. It's tough, and I think that's why when I first got introduced to the CEO of Votes, I immediately resonated with that particular problem, that I've been in that situation. I have voted in a primary where by the time my ballot got counted, the person I was voting for had already dropped out of the race because it took so long for the ballot to get there. And it's just a waste of a vote. So if you have the ability to vote on your phone, not only does it increase accessibility, your right to participate in the process. And what we've seen is, in cases where states that have adopted this, doubling the turnout rate in a lot of cases of people who do vote. But the other thing is that there are states like, Monica, you're currently in California. There's supposed to be like 30 ballot initiatives potentially on the ballot in California this year. Arizona is going to have a similar number. There's several states that have either citizen ballot initiatives or legislative ballot initiatives. You end up with complex legal language on your ballot when you show up in November. And if you're not prepared for that, a lot of people show up and it's the first time they're seeing that. And you have a line of people out the door behind you. You're being asked to vote on these really important proposition questions, but also things like judges or city councilmen and different positions that you're not as familiar with. And a lot of people will either leave it blank or Christmas tree all the way down. So if you have the ability to sit on your couch and take your time to educate yourself on the policies, do some Googling, talk to ChatGPT, ask, phone a friend, whatever it is you're going to do, it lowers the stress level and it allows people to make an educated decision. And that's exactly what we're hoping for when we want to put this power in people's hands.
During COVID, I think that was the first time that I did mail-in ballots, and I don't think I'll ever go back again for that exact reason. You talked about sitting on my couch and Googling it and looking up the judges that I would have previously left blank because I didn't know enough about them. So I go in and I know exactly who I'm voting for from the top to the bottom, and having that digitally would make it that much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done a fair number of interviews with conservative podcasters who actually like the fact that we do require a photo ID. I mean, there's really no way to do an online, a mobile or online election without using photo ID because you couldn't validate somebody's identity. So there's a lot of ways where this technology provides greater access to the ballot, which I think a lot of progressives care about. But it also provides a high level of security, which a lot of conservatives care about. So I think it's one of the unusual situations where there's like bipartisan support for this. The early states that implemented mobile voting for military voters were Republican states. I think West Virginia started this in 2018. The Arizona and Utah, and now several the blue-leaning states have come on. Oregon, Michigan, Massachusetts, and some others have been testing this out for military voters. I believe Nevada is actually one of them as well, because for tribal voters, where it can be hundreds of miles of driving to get to a polling location. Yeah. So some of those reservations are enormous. And so trialing it out as mobile voting as an option. In Ontario, Canada, they went even further, and Ontario said all municipal elections, people now have the choice to vote by phone. And so people are this year are going to be, it's going to be widely available for their local elections. So they're, experimenting that way. I think it's very exciting to see this technology develop. And for us, I believe that we can show a vision of democracy for the 21st century that provides people a reason to re-engage in the process.
Yeah. And I just want to touch on this quickly because you've mentioned the word blockchain a couple times, and I have a basic working knowledge of what blockchain is, but many people may not.
Mhm.
And I think people, if you can give them a basic understanding of it so they know how secure blockchain is, because it is very secure.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's good. I'm glad you bring that up, because the other thing too is that we got to point out the fact there's no crypto involved in here. This is oftentimes the thing that people like freak out about often with blockchain is actually the crypto stuff, because there've been a lot of scams and there was Sam Bankman-Fried and stole a lot of money. All of that sort of standard investor fraud, which has been going on for hundreds of years. Crypto just gave them a new way to do it. But there's no crypto involved in this. The way blockchain works is that it's basically a decentralized ledger. So if you think about your bank, where it's recording all the transactions of things that you bought or sold, your income and your spending, you're relying on the bank to keep accountability of what's in your bank account, and they get paid bank fees for that, right? You pay quite a bit of money actually to transfer, wire transfers, but monthly fees, whatever. They earn interest off your money. That's how they work. And they are a central maintainer of that accounting ledger. So in the period after the financial market crash, 2008 and 9, this is actually where Bitcoin really developed. The idea was, what if you could do this without a bank? What if you could have a system for people to buy and sell from one another in a trusted, decentralized accounting ledger, and you didn't need a bank as the intermediary in the process, because a lot of the banks were falling apart at that point, right? So the whole concept of Bitcoin was, all right, you're going to maintain multiple copies of this accounting ledger on a bunch of different computers all over the world, and you got to pay them for processing transactions and verifying that a transaction is real and that it's not an attempt to defraud somebody. So they all have to simultaneously verify transactions onto the blockchain, and if they all agree, then the transaction gets added to the blockchain and they earn a little bit of Bitcoin for their effort, right? That's how that system works. What Votes is using is a Hyperledger Fabric, which is a private blockchain where there are independent auditors. So instead of a copy of the chain existing in a bunch of computers all throughout the world, the copies of the chain are available. You can look at them, audit them. So there are independent auditors, as well as some of the political parties, some of the government agencies who are running, using the technology for real elections. We've actually talked to them about coming on as a node processor, so that we as a nonprofit could also be validating blocks being put onto the chain. But basically, you require 100% consensus. Everybody, including, these will be some cases, Republicans and Democrats, or different governments, city, state, whatever, they all have to agree that a block deserves to go on the chain. And they have an active incentive not to work together, to collude, in other words, because they would be potentially competing against each other. So that's how the system can work. It requires 100% consensus so that no vote can get added or changed or manipulated, to make certain that the vote that's cast is the same vote that's counted when you close out the election.
Cool. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Christy and I are all in on all of this, and I would like to think that most voters, when they learn about it, would be too, but Christy and I are also pretty immersed in all of it. So if you were talking to the average voter that is feeling pretty disillusioned with politics right now, what's your message to them?
I would say that it is easy to feel disengaged. There are all sorts of reasons why we should feel disengaged. But if we're going to be hopeful, it's that perhaps the technologies that have cost people, or there's fear that has cost people their jobs, or there's fear that there's these negative consequences, maybe there's an opportunity to turn these technologies for public good. And all we need people to do is re-engage in the process. Educate yourself on the legislation, download the app and vote, or go on our website, digitaldemocracyproject.org, and learn about the bills and vote. That is all we need. We need people to care enough to tell legislators how they want them to vote on bills that are being debated. And wouldn't it be nice, I would say to grandma or a friend or a nephew or niece, wouldn't it be nice if the next time America chooses to go to war, then all of us have a say in that decision.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, I love that. And Ramon, can you tell our listeners where they can learn more about the Democracy Project and get a hold of you if they need to?
Absolutely. Digital Democracy Project is at digitaldemocracyproject.org. You can also Google us. There's more. There is another one, I think, in Canada, but if you go to digitaldemocracyproject.org, you'll find us. And this is a community grassroots effort. This is all volunteer team. The money that we raise from donations, we spend on servers and software licenses and increasingly AI tokens. So, we need donations, but we also need volunteers. If you know how to write code and you want to help us out, please help us out. If you track legislation for a living in your state, if you know what's going on in your state, we want to be in all 50 states by 2027. So we're currently tracking bills in 7 state houses, but we also track federal legislation. So any American can vote on federal bills. And for people who live in Virginia, Washington, Utah, Arizona, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Florida, you can weigh in on state legislation. And so we're going to need people who can help us track bills, who can help us spread the word, who can help us like and share and subscribe and do all the things on social, and who can make donations. And, it's going to take all of us to regain control of a democracy that feels like it's off the rails right now. And it is every generation of Americans' responsibility to pick up the baton and carry it one step forward.
This was like a big billboard for civic engagement. I love it.
I was just going to say the word civic engagement. That used to be an American value, that your ability and your willingness to vote was something that you were proud of. And I think a lot of people have lost both that pride and that motivation. So yeah, civic engagement, indeed. I would say.
Absolutely.
And we're going to include links to your TED Talk, the Democracy Project website, the voting app, the tally maps, the scoreboards, and the AI voting assistant in our show notes so that people can access them directly from there as well. So
wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, I do think that the work that you guys are doing is so critical in this, and it's going to take the voices of people in independent media who can spread the word about new ideas, because it's an effort of all of us to rebuild what we believe was our patrimony, but what we're seeing very quickly slip away.
Well, we're happy to do it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Glad to have you on. I really hope that this spreads. I think this could be a really valuable tool for every American. And Ramon, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your story, your vision, and for a more participatory democracy.
Thank you so much for having me.
And whether people agree with every aspect of the project or not, I think everyone can agree that finding ways to reconnect citizens to government is a conversation worth having. It was an amazing conversation today, and now I'm coming out of this energized again. I think we all have a tendency to get worn down. This makes me excited about it again. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
To our listeners, if you're finding meaning in the stories we're sharing, if something moves you, challenges you, makes you see the world a little differently, please like, comment, and share. It helps more than you know.
And follow us everywhere at The Politics Chicks on Substack, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook.
Thanks for being a part of our community, folks. Keep shining your light so we can find each other in the dark.
And remember that we're stronger together. Ramon, thank you again.
Thanks,
This
Ramon.
was a great conversation.
Thank you both.
See you guys next time.